Okay, in this segment, I want to begin with the phase 4 of the revolution from 1997 to 2005, coinciding with the presidency of Muhammad Khatami, arguably the most popular president in the post-Khomeini era. Now, let me begin by noting that some scholars believe that the election of moderate and reformist Khatami in 2005 as a president was actually engineered and rigged by Rafsanjani, and his motivation was to avenge the loss of power to the leader. So in phase 4, you're beginning to see a conflict among the ruling elites, especially among the two that were allies, Rafsanjani and Khamenei. According to this scenario, if it's true, Rafsanjani helped rig the election in favor of Khatami to defeat the leader's chosen candidate. He was the Speaker of the Majlis. His name was Natiq Nouri. So that's one scenario. And as I said, we don't have evidence of the kind that I could incontrovertibly point to see whether that was the case. But a lot of people actually believe this was the case. At any rate, rigged or not, President Khatami ended up winning a very impressive victory, and with a promise of reforming and transforming the Islamic Republic into what he later on called a civil society. In many ways, Khatami owed his victory to a huge turnout by two groups, the youth and the women's voters. Both of these groups turned out in large numbers, and they were very, very supportive of Khatami in both his first term and his second term. So this 8-year period covers the presidency of Muhammad Khatami. Now, in many ways, Khatami's election really should be considered for the defender of Islamic Republic as a kind of a day of reckoning. His election brought the revolution's path to a fork. So you had two paths to follow. One road was a path of reform, a path of reconstruction, a path of civil society that President Khatami championed. The other path was one of forcefully advocating status quo and minimizing reform. This second path was advocated by the extreme wing of the ruling class. And the extreme wing was bent on reinforcing and insulating a theocracy which by now had become the fate of the republic, the initial republic, to insulate that theocracy against the threats of change, openness, and everything else that would challenge the rules by especially modern Western values. These people felt deeply threatened with the election of Khatami and his reformist agenda, and also they were scared of his popularity because they suddenly saw the first popular leader since Ayatollah Khomeini had passed away. What is interesting about this conflict that developed among the ruling elites, and remember, I'm not even talking about the opposition that was outside of the ruling elite. This is people who are committed to the very idea of Islamic Republic. The two camps were equally committed to the survival of the Islamic Republic in the long run, and they believed that their plan, their policy would best ensure such a survival. The problem was that each camp had a diametrically opposite assumption regarding what would be the best means to ensure the Republic's long-term survival. Khatami believed that in the long run, for the Islamic Republic to survive, it necessitates dealing with change, instituting the reforms, and learning to adapt to the imperatives of modern era, to the imperatives of a very complex and interdependent world where masses are better informed than ever and are demanding greater voices for their individual freedoms as well as their participation in governance, the phenomena we call, of course, the civil society. So Khatami was convinced that reform and change would truly strengthen the Islamic Republic. It would make it more legitimate, and that Islamic Republic would be able to fully withstand such metamorphosis and would be able to more fully, Iran as an Islamic Republic, would be able to more fully participate in the global community and in the global economy. Therefore, reform and change were the keys to the long-term survival of Islamic Republic from President Khatami's view. At the very same time, there was another parallel movement who was championed by Islamic philosophers, the younger Islamic philosophers and theologians, and what they were calling, after the death of Khomeini, was a kind of Islamic Reformation, almost on par to that of a Protestant Reformation. So you have the philosophers, Islamic philosophers and theologians, the younger ones, as well as a younger president, all looking for change. And some of these change were going to the very core of Islamic institutions and Islamic beliefs. So you can imagine that with the rise of his call for Islamic Reformation as advocated by people like Surush, by people like Shabastari, and by people like Kadivar, the conservative group, were very much threatened. Both Khatami's election, his well-known popularity, the momentum that his election generated for change, and then the momentum that came from the Islamic philosophers and theologians calling for reformation, they were felt very deeply and in a very threatening way by the extreme conservative wing of the ruling elite, who were the key elite support base of the leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. The old guards really believed that if reform were to be instituted at the scale envisioned by President Khatami, and the kind of reformation that was gaining momentum advocated by the philosophers and theologians, the reformist philosophers and theologians, that would bring down the Islamic Republic. Now notice, the conflict is within the ruling elite. It's not people from the outside. In fact, by the time that Khatami is elected president, the outside, the non-ruling elites, the counter-elites have been almost entirely excluded from participation into politics. So the conflict we're talking about is among the various factions in the ruling elites. The bedrock assumption of the conservative or the extreme conservative was, if reform, this system will be quickly weakened, and in short order, the momentum of change will become unstoppable. In other words, the conservative clerics genuinely believed that the reform will bring down the whole house. Pretty much the same way they looked at the Soviet Union as an example, and they keep reminding themselves and their colleagues that this is what will happen if we go the path of reform that's being advocated by the current president. So for the conservatives, the mortal threat coming from President Khatami to the foundation of the Islamic Republic was not from the secular opposition, but from what they consider to be the naive, reform-minded clerics and lay wing of the ruling elites and these Reformation advocates among the philosophers. So we have a real fight among the ruling elites. And beginning in 1999, the conservatives begin their backlash. And the backlash is carried out with vengeance. They launch what became known as serial murders, and they started to murder intellectuals, starting with the secular intellectuals especially. And these people were regarded by the secular population as the vanguard of democracy, as the vanguard of civil society. And when the students began to protest in masses, they were brutally suppressed by the Revolutionary Guards and the paramilitary force under their rule called the Basijis. Again, when I describe the structure of the Iranian government, you will see that the Basijis are the paramilitary part of the Revolutionary Guard. So you have a real kind of an internal war going on between the factions as President Khatami begins to implement in a very modest way his reform. Be that as it may, under President Khatami, there was greater freedom of the press. You get a proliferation of newspapers coming out. The media, I use the word press advisedly because the media is still controlled by the leadership, and the leader was aligned with the conservative. But the press is very lively. A lot of critical articles are being written of some of the conservatives, and also a lot of articles being written that you would not see in a press that is very much censored. So there was this opening, or if you like, a glasnost as far as the press was concerned. Visibly too, Iran changed in that there was a relaxation of the strict Islamic dress code for men and women. So under Khatami, at least in the urban areas where a good part of his support resided, there was this kind of a outward signs of moderation. Khatami was also a very articulate spokesperson, and in one of his first addresses to the world, he addressed the American nation, and he spoke about the walls of mistrust that existed between Iran and the United States, and that the path to improving relations between Iran and the United States is in getting rid of this wall of mistrust. And when that happens, then eventually relations between the United States and Iran would improve. But first, we need a dialogue of nations. And he quite deliberately used the word dialogue of the civilization to underscore a phenomena that was gaining currency in the United States thanks to the writing of Samuel Huntington. He wrote a book called The Clashes of Civilization, where he predicted an inevitable conflict between the East and the West. So quite aptly, in opposing that type of mindset, Khatami talked about dialogue of civilization as a basis of improving relations with the United States. The other thing that happened under Khatami that was significant was that in 2003 he launched what was really in the Constitution, and that was creation of local councils. And he allowed local council elections. These elections really were the closest Iran would come to establishing grassroots democracy. Political organizations and quasi-political parties, and the reason I say quasi-political parties because political parties were banned, they began to flourish around this time, and over 100 political organizations were actually registered. So up to in 2003, in Khatami's second term, we have these elections, and at the same time, the conservatives are very much accumulating their powers, and they are beginning to undermine attempt at reform and change in Iran. I want to add at this point that Khatami himself at the end decided that change was too dangerous. As he began to advocate change, he quickly realized that he could lose control of that change. And one of the things that I know was in the back of his mind, and I say I know because on the basis of interviews I did in Iran in 2005, this was confirmed. He really was very much concerned about having the same fate as that of Gorbachev. Recall that Gorbachev was the champion of reform, but at the end he became the victim of the reforms that he had started, and he could never recover. And even though he was very popular abroad, he became one of the most unpopular leaders in the history of Russia, not just Soviet Union. So it is my thesis that even though Khatami talked a good talk about reform, when it came to walking the walk, he panicked and he decided that he really is not going to go forward with the reform, and he settled for far less than he had spoken about or the kind of expectation that he had generated as far as the reform was concerned. So one of the sad part about this period of Khatami presidency is that it started with lots of hope for change and for moderation, for metamorphosis of Islamic Republic into a civil society, something that Iranians truly deserved. And by the end of his presidency, he is very, very unpopular. Almost every poll indicate that he was seen as somebody who betrayed the promises that he made. And for him, he accepted that, because for him, if his reform was going to in any way threaten the longevity or even very existence of the Islamic Republic, he would not be for it. So here we had a very interesting situation. Two factions, both equally committed to the longevity and to the perpetuity of Islamic Republic, with radically two different formula. The one that advocated reform at the end decided that major reforms will endanger it, and the group that were against the reform from the very beginning end up actually proving their point. Which one was right? I tend to side with the conservative people. I think they were right. I think if Iran had gone the path of Khatami, the Islamic Republic would have been a thing of a past, because the momentum of change was too powerful, and the resources of that institution, that republic with its leader, were too meager to be able to cope with that momentum.